The airport was buzzing with life, as it always did. People hurried across the polished floors, dragging their suitcases behind them, clutching passports and glancing nervously at the glowing departure screens. Among the many travelers that evening was a young black teen girl named Maya. She was only 16, traveling alone for the very first time. Her mother had hugged her tightly before security, whispering words of encouragement, and now Maya carried those words in her heart like a shield. Her flight was boarding. She clutched her small backpack and stepped into the long line of passengers. Around her were families with children, businessmen scrolling through phones, and couples speaking in hushed voices. To everyone else, this was just another ordinary flight. To Maya, it felt like stepping into a world far bigger than herself as she walked down the narrow jet bridge. Her stomach fluttered with nerves. The smell of airplane fuel mixed with the cool air conditioning made the moment feel unreal. She entered the plane, smiling politely at the first flight attendant who stood near the door. The woman gave her a quick nod but didn't smile back. Maya didn't think much of it. She was too focused on finding her seat. She shuffled down the aisle, clutching her boarding pass. Seat 18A, a window seat. She breathed a small sigh of relief when she found it. Sliding past a man in the aisle seat, she tucked her bag under the seat in front of her and sat down. The window beside her showed the glowing runway lights stretching into the distance. She pressed her palm against the cool glass, imagining the plane lifting into the sky around her. The cabin was filled with the usual noise, people placing bags in overhead bins, the rustle of seatbelts clicking, the laughter of children bouncing in their seats. A baby began to cry somewhere in the back, and a mother whispered soothingly. The announcements buzzed over the speakers, welcoming everyone aboard, reminding them to switch off devices, to buckle up. To prepare for the flight ahead, Maya sat quietly, listening, trying not to draw attention to herself. She wasn't one to cause trouble. She followed rules carefully. Her mother had told her, "Be polite, listen to the crew, and you'll be fine." So she sat straight, hands folded. Waiting for the journey to begin, a flight attendant walked down the aisle, checking seatbelts. She was tall, with sharp features, her hair pulled tightly back. Her steps were brisk, her eyes scanning each row with impatience. When she reached Maya's row, her gaze lingered longer than usual. Maya felt it. That heavy stare that made her shrink slightly into her seat. She quickly tugged on her seatbelt to show it was fastened. The attendant said nothing and moved on. Maya let out a breath of relief. She told herself it was nothing, just nerves. Everyone was tired. Everyone was in a rush. That's all. The plane doors closed with a loud thud. The hum of the engines grew stronger, vibrating through the floor. Passengers settled down, putting away their phones and adjusting pillows. The captain's voice came on, smooth and practiced, announcing the flight time and weather at the destination. Maya glanced around. The woman across the aisle was flipping through a magazine. A teenage boy 2 rows ahead had his headphones in, bobbing his head to music only he could hear. Everything looked perfectly normal, perfectly ordinary. She pulled out a small notebook from her bag. It was her habit to write down thoughts when she felt nervous. She scribbled a few lines about the airport, the people she saw, the way the plane smelled faintly of metal and fabric cleaner. She wrote about her excitement to see her aunt, who would be waiting for her on the other side. For a while, Maya felt at peace. The plane was just another place full of people going somewhere. People who didn't know her story, people she didn't know either. She felt invisible, and for her, that was comforting. But as the attendants prepared for the safety demonstration, Maya noticed the same woman from before, the sharp-eyed flight attendant, looking her way again. This time, the woman's lips pressed into a thin line, and Maya felt her heart skip. She wasn't sure why. She hadn't done anything wrong. She sat still, her notebook closed on her lap. her seatbelt fastened properly. The attendant turned away, continuing with her tasks. Yet, the feeling lingered. Maya swallowed hard, trying to push it aside. It was probably nothing. She reminded herself again. Just follow the rules, stay quiet. And the flight would pass quickly. Passengers clapped politely as the safety instructions ended. The plane began to move, rolling slowly away from the gate, its wings gleaming under the lights. Maya pressed her forehead lightly to the window, watching the ground crew wave their glowing sticks. It was a sight that made her feel small, but also excited. She was really flying by herself for the first time. To anyone watching from the outside, it was just a normal flight. A routine evening departure with passengers heading to their destinations. But inside, an invisible thread of tension had already started to weave itself around Maya and the crew. None of the passengers knew it yet, but this flight would not go as planned. The quiet beginning, the ordinary chatter. The hum of engine seas would soon give way to something far louder, far more unforgettable. And as Maya sat in her window seat, clutching her notebook, staring at the runway lights, she had no idea that the simple act of being herself, of simply existing in this space, would soon draw her into a storm that would stop the entire plane. Asterisk. The plane's engines rumbled as it slowly rolled onto the taxiway. Passengers shifted in their seats, ready for the long flight ahead. The air buzzed with small conversations, whispers between couples, the soft laughter of a child, the rustling of magazines. It was the kind of ordinary background noise that always filled an airplane before takeoff. But for Maya, sitting quietly by the window in seat 18A, the ordinary was about to break. The same flight attendant who had looked at her before was walking down the aisle again. This time checking passengers more closely. Her shoes clicked sharply against the floor, her eyes darting from row to row. When she reached Maya, she stopped suddenly, her body blocking the light from the overhead lamps. Maya looked up, startled. The woman's expression was cold, her lips tight. Her eyes narrowing as if Maya had done something wrong. "Hey," the attendant said sharply, her voice louder than it needed to be. "What are you doing?" Maya blinked, confused. She had been sitting still, her seatbelt fastened, her notebook closed on her lap. I'm just sitting," she replied softly. The attendant's eyes darted to the notebook, then back to Maya's face. "You shouldn't have that out right now," she snapped. "All devices and items should be put away." Maya froze. She knew the safety rules: electronics needed to be off, bags under the seat, seatbelts on. But her notebook wasn't electronic. It was just paper. She tried to explain. "It's just a notebook, ma'am. No battery, don't talk back to me." The attendant suddenly barked, her voice echoing through the cabin. Heads turned. Passengers nearby looked up from their seats, startled by the sharpness in her tone. Maya's cheeks burned. Her throat tightened. She hadn't meant to argue. She hadn't even raised her voice. But the attendant loomed over her, scowling, as if she were a threat to the entire plane. "Put it away now," the woman shouted. "Do you understand? Or do I need to have you removed from this flight?" The words cut deep. Maya's hands shook as she clutched the notebook to her chest. Removed from the flight. For writing quietly in her seat. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the fabric of her chair and vanish from the dozens of eyes now staring at her. Passengers whispered. Some frowned at the attendant, surprised by her tone. Others shook their heads, muttering under their breath. A man across the aisle pulled out his phone, angling it carefully as if to record. The moment had shifted from an ordinary reminder of safety rules into a public humiliation. Maya felt tears sting her eyes. But she refused to let them fall. Her mother had told her to stay strong no matter what. But the heat in her chest, the ache in her throat, made it almost impossible. I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice trembling. She slid the notebook into her bag, her hands shaking so badly she almost dropped it. The attendant crossed her arms, glaring as if she had won some kind of battle. "Good," she said coldly, before raising her voice again for all to hear. "Follow the rules, or you won't be on this plane long." Gasps rippled through the cabin. The humiliation was complete. Maya shrank into her seat, wishing the window beside her could open so she could run away. Her heart pounded, her skin hot with shame. She hadn't broken any rules, but the way the attendant shouted made sound as though she had committed a crime. The man recording across the aisle shook his head, muttering, "Unbelievable." A woman 2 rows ahead turned back, frowning, her lips pressed tight with disapproval. The energy in the cabin shifted. It wasn't just Maya who felt the tension, now everyone could feel it. But the flight attendant didn't care. She turned sharply on her heel and marched back down the aisle, leaving behind a silence heavy with disbelief. Maya sat frozen, her hands clenched in her lap, her body trembling. She could still feel the weight of every passenger's eyes on her, even as they slowly turned back around. She had never felt so small, so powerless. Her only crime had been existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, with the wrong person towering over her. Her chest tightened as she took a shaky breath. The humiliation was unbearable, but underneath it, something else began to stir. A spark. A memory of her mother's words. "If anyone mistreats you, don't stay silent. Speak up. You have a voice. Use it." Maya's fingers brushed against her phone inside her bag. Her hand trembled as she wrapped it around the device, holding it close. She didn't know what she would say yet. She didn't even know if she had the courage. But deep inside, she understood one thing. This wasn't over. And as the engines roared louder, preparing for takeoff, the passengers settled back uneasily, whispering about what had just happened. None of them knew it yet. But the spark growing inside Maya was about to ignite into something far larger than anyone could imagine. The cabin of the plane had gone strangely quiet after the flight attendant's outburst. The echo of her sharp voice still hung in the air, like a bell that wouldn't stop ringing in people's ears. Maya sat frozen by the window, her heart pounding so loudly she thought others might hear it. Her face burned, her hands were stiff, her throat ached from holding back tears. She had done nothing wrong, she knew it. The passengers knew it, but the sting of being yelled at in front of strangers was unbearable. She had tried to disappear into her seat, but the silence told her it was too late. People had seen. People had heard. Slowly, the whispers began. A man a few rows behind leaned forward to the woman next to him. "Did you see that? That was uncalled for." The woman shook her head, murmuring, "I've flown dozens of times. I've never seen an attendant snap like that." Across the aisle, the man who had been recording shook his head in disbelief, still holding his phone steady. He whispered to the woman beside him, "She didn't do a thing. Just a notebook. That's all." The woman nodded, her eyes narrowing with anger. That poor girl. The murmurs spread like ripples in water. Some passengers shifted uncomfortably, unsure whether to speak up or stay quiet. Others looked back at Maya with sympathetic eyes. She kept her head low, staring at her lap, wishing the stares would fade. Then a voice broke the silence. A middle-aged woman 2 rows up turned in her seat and called softly, "Are you okay, sweetheart?" Her voice carried kindness, but it also carried across the quiet cabin. Making others look up, Maya hesitated, biting her lip. She didn't want to cry. She didn't want to show weakness. But her silence was answer enough. The woman's eyes softened. She glared toward the front of the plane where the attendant had disappeared. That was wrong. The woman muttered, loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. She had no right to shout at her like that. More nods followed. Another passenger chimed in, a younger man with headphones draped around his neck. If that was my kid, I'd be furious. Completely unnecessary. Phones began to appear in more hands. Screens glowed faintly as people tapped to record, some holding them discreetly at chest level, others more boldly in plain sight. What had started as one frightened girl being yelled at was slowly turning into a scene the entire cabin couldn't ignore. One man in the back raised his voice a little. "She's just a teenager. Why yell at her like that?" His words carried down the aisle, adding fuel to the growing discomfort. Not everyone reacted the same. A few passengers avoided looking, burying themselves in magazines or pretending to nap. But even they shifted in their seats, their tension clear. No one liked what they had witnessed. Even if they weren't ready to say it out loud. Maya sat quietly, her fingers brushing over her phone in her bag. She could hear every whisper, every muttered comment. For the first time since the shouting, she didn't feel completely alone. People had seen the truth. They knew she hadn't done anything wrong, but the flight attendant returned a moment later, walking briskly down the aisle again. Her sharp eyes scanned the passengers. She noticed the glowing phones, the people staring at her, the judgment in their faces. For a split second, her expression faltered, but then she straightened. Her voice clipped and firm. "Everyone needs to stay seated and follow instructions," she barked. "We're about to take off." The man with the phone across the aisle raised an eyebrow, not lowering his camera. Another passenger muttered, "Instructions. How about respect?" The attendant's face tightened. She turned sharply, avoiding further confrontation, and disappeared toward the galley. But the damage was done. The cabin had changed. The passengers no longer saw her as a figure of authority to be respected without question. They saw her as the aggressor, the one who had turned a routine flight into an unnecessary scene. Maya's chest rose and fell shakily. She could feel the passengers' support like a quiet shield around her. But inside, her humiliation still burned. Being seen didn't erase the pain of being yelled at. Of being singled out without reason. Her phone vibrated slightly in her hand, and she clutched it tighter. She thought of her mother's words again. "If you're ever treated unfairly, don't be afraid to stand up. Don't let silence be the answer." The murmurs in the cabin grew stronger, more confident. "She needs to be reported. You can't talk to a kid like that. If I were her, I'd call someone." Maya lifted her eyes for the first time since the incident. She looked around at the strangers who had become silent witnesses to her humiliation. Their eyes met hers, some with sympathy, others with quiet encouragement. And in that moment, the spark inside her grew into a flame. She realized she wasn't powerless. She wasn't voiceless. One call, one action could shift the balance completely. The attendant might have shouted the loudest, but Maya still had something stronger. The truth, and people willing to see it. Her hand slid into her bag. She pulled out her phone, her fingers trembling as she unlocked the screen. Her chest tightened, her breath quickened, but her resolve grew steady. She knew exactly who she would call. The whispers quieted as a few passengers noticed. Heads tilted, curious, as Maya raised the phone to her ear. The flame had become fire, and no one on that plane passenger crew or pilot was ready for what would happen next. The plane's engines hummed deeper as it edged closer to the runway. The cabin lights dimmed slightly, casting a soft glow over rows of tense faces. Passengers were whispering less now, though the energy in the air was far from calm. Every eye that had seen the earlier confrontation carried the same thought. Something about this wasn't right. Maya sat stiffly in her seat, her phone clutched tightly in her hand. Her heart raced, beating so fast she felt it might burst. Her mother's voice echoed in her head again and again. "If you're ever treated unfairly, don't stay silent. Speak up. You have a voice. Use it. She stared down at the black screen, her reflection trembling in its glass. Should she? Could she? She was only 16, a passenger on a crowded plane. What difference could her voice make? And yet, deep inside, a fire burned. The humiliation still stung, being shouted at, treated like a criminal, made small before strangers. But more than the shame, there was something else rising within her. A refusal to let this moment define her. Her fingers slid across the screen. She opened her contacts, scrolled quickly, and pressed one name. Her breath caught as the phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Passengers nearby noticed. Heads tilted curiously, watching her with quiet expectation. Hello. A calm, strong voice answered. Maya's throat tightened, but she forced the words out. Auntie, it's me. I need help. The woman on the other end didn't hesitate. Maya, what's wrong? Where are you? I'm on the plane, Maya whispered, her voice trembling. She glanced toward the front where the flight attendant had disappeared. One of the attendants. She yelled at me, threatened to remove me. I didn't do anything wrong. Please. I don't feel safe. There was silence for only a beat. Then her aunt's voice sharpened, filled with authority. Stay calm. Tell me the flight number. Maya's hands shook as she read it from the boarding pass tucked in her pocket. Her aunt listened carefully, her tone steady, controlled, the kind of voice used to giving orders. Unknown to most of the passengers, Maya's aunt worked in aviation law enforcement. She wasn't just family, she was someone with the power to make calls that mattered. Thank you, sweetheart, her aunt said firmly. I'll handle it. Stay seated and don't let anyone intimidate you. Maya's eyes burned with tears, but this time they weren't from shame. They were from relief. She whispered, "Thank you," before ending the call. The man across the aisle, the one who had been recording, leaned closer and spoke softly. You okay? Maya nodded slightly, though her heart was still racing. I think it's going to be okay now. Within minutes, a ripple of movement stirred at the front of the plane. The captain's voice came over the intercom, calm but tense. Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We've been asked to pause before takeoff. Please remain seated and calm as we await further instructions. Gasps spread through the rows. People exchanged confused looks. Pause. One woman muttered, "What does that mean?" Another man frowned. We were about to take off. Why stop now? The engine softened as the plane slowed, veering off the main taxiway. Through the windows, passengers could see runway lights flashing by, but the plane was no longer heading for the sky. It was turning back. Whispers filled the air. Phones came out again, cameras rolling. The energy inside the cabin was electric confusion, shock, and an edge of anticipation. Something was happening, and it was big. Maya sat frozen, her phone still in her lap. She hadn't expected it to be this fast. She hadn't expected one call to create such a shift. The flight attendant reappeared. Her face pale now, her composure cracked. She hurried toward the cockpit, whispering urgently to another crew member. Passengers noticed the change immediately. The woman who had once barked orders so loudly now looked unsettled, almost frightened. What's going on? Someone demanded from the back. Another passenger called out, "Why are we turning back?" No answer came. The intercom remained silent. The crew avoided eye contact, and the tension grew heavier. Maya pressed her lips together, her heart still pounding, but a strange calm settled over her. For the first time since boarding, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel powerless. She had done something that no yelling, no humiliation could erase. Minutes later, the captain's voice returned. Ladies and gentlemen, due to a directive we've just received, this aircraft will be returning to the gate. Please remain seated until we've stopped. The words hit like thunder. Returning to the gate, before takeoff. The passengers erupted in gasps, mutters, even shouts of disbelief. What? Are you serious? Grounded. And yet, deep inside, many of them already knew why. They had seen it. They had recorded it. They had witnessed the spark that had now become fire. Maya sat still, her eyes wide but steady as the plane rolled back toward the terminal. Every turn of the wheels felt like proof. Her voice mattered. Her call had reached beyond the aisle, beyond the cabin. It had reached the very heart of the system, and the system had listened. For the other passengers, it was shocking. For the flight crew, it was unsettling. But for Maya, it was transformative. The moment she had been humiliated became the moment she rose, and as the plane slowed to a stop near the gate, silence fell once again. The passengers waited, holding their breath, knowing they were now part of something unforgettable. What had started as one girl being yelled at had just grounded an entire plane. Asterisk. The plane slowed with a deep groan of its engines, the cabin tilting slightly as the wheels pressed firmly into the taxiway. What had moments ago felt like the ordinary start of a journey now felt like a movie scene unfolding in real time. Passengers clutched armrests, craned their necks toward the windows, and whispered in low voices as the aircraft rolled away from the runway lights. The hum that usually filled the cabin before takeoff was gone. Instead, there was an uneasy silence, broken only by the occasional gasp or mutter. "Why are we stopping?" a man near the back asked, his voice loud with frustration. A mother holding her baby frowned and whispered, "This isn't normal." Maya sat frozen in her seat, her heart hammering in her chest. Through the window, she could see the bright lights of the terminal growing closer again. She pressed her hand against the cool glass, trying to steady her breath. She hadn't thought her call would move so quickly, hadn't imagined it would ripple across the entire plane like this. The captain's voice returned, calm but strained, over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, as mentioned earlier, we have been instructed to return to the gate. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened. I repeat, remain seated. Thank you for your cooperation." The words dropped like stones into the silence. Instructed to return. Cooperation. Passengers exchanged sharp looks, their confusion thick in the air. Instructed? By who? A woman demanded from the middle rows. This doesn't just happen. Phones lit up across the cabin as people began texting loved ones, some recording the announcement to capture the strange turn of events. Screens glowed like small stars in the dimmed cabin. Proof that what was happening wasn't ordinary. The flight attendant, the same one who had yelled at Maya, walked quickly down the aisle again. But this time, her voice wasn't loud, wasn't sharp. She spoke in hushed tones to her fellow crew members, her eyes darting nervously toward the passengers who were clearly recording. Her earlier authority seemed to have melted away. Maya noticed. Everyone noticed. The shift was undeniable. The man across the aisle, who had been recording from the start, leaned slightly toward Maya and whispered, "This is because of you, isn't it?" His tone wasn't accusing yet, was impressed, almost protective. Maya swallowed hard, unsure if she should answer. She only lowered her eyes, clutching her phone tight in her hand. The plane came to a halt near the gate. The sudden stillness sent a shiver through the passengers. Planes didn't just stop after leaving the runway unless something serious was happening. People knew that. The seatbelt signs remained on. No one was allowed to stand. The silence was heavy, broken by the soft hum of the air vents. Then, footsteps echoed from outside the plane. Through the small oval windows, flashes of movement could be seen. Airport staff, security vehicles with flashing lights, and figures approaching the aircraft door. Gasps spread like wildfire. "What's going on?" someone asked sharply. Is this an emergency? Another voice rose, nervous and high-pitched. Are we in danger? The cabin crew whispered urgently at the front, their faces pale. One attendant disappeared into the cockpit, the door closing quickly behind her. The one who had humiliated Maya avoided looking down the aisle, keeping her back stiff, her posture tight. But even from behind, passengers could see her unease. The man with headphones pulled them off completely, muttering, "We're not taking off tonight. That's for sure." His words carried a mix of shock and disbelief. Maya's stomach twisted, but not with fear, anymore with realization. Her call had reached someone powerful. Her aunt's voice, calm and steady on the phone, had carried more weight than the flight attendants shouting ever could. She had been silenced in one moment, but in the next, her voice had grounded the entire plane. A woman across the aisle whispered to her husband, "That girl. She called someone. Did you see? This must be connected." The husband nodded, his eyes fixed on Maya with a mixture of curiosity and respect. For the first time since boarding, Maya didn't feel invisible. She didn't feel powerless. The humiliation of being shouted at still lingered, but it was no longer the whole story. Now, she was the reason every passenger was sitting in stunned silence, waiting for answers. Minutes passed, heavy and slow. Finally, the captain's voice returned once more. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated. Security personnel will be boarding the aircraft shortly. We ask for your patience during this process." That single sentence confirmed what everyone already suspected. This wasn't a technical issue. This wasn't a weather delay. This was something bigger, something human. Whispers erupted again. Security. Why? This is serious. Someone's in trouble. And though no names were spoken, many passengers' eyes turned in the same direction toward the flight attendant who had shouted, and toward the quiet girl by the window who had dared to make a call. Maya sat still, her heart racing but her gaze steady. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The plane had stopped. The system had listened, and as the heavy door at the front clicked and swung open, letting in the sight of uniformed figures ready to step inside, the truth settled over the passengers like a storm about to break. One girl's voice had been enough to bring an entire flight to a standstill. What had started as humiliation was now turning into accountability. Asterisk. The hiss of the cabin door opening cut through the silence like a blade. Passengers turned their heads sharply as uniformed airport security stepped inside. Their reflective vests glowed under the cabin lights, and the sight of them sent a wave of murmurs down the aisle. This wasn't a delay anymore. This was official. "Ladies and gentlemen, please remain seated," one officer announced firmly, his voice carrying authority. "We've been asked to speak with certain crew members and gather statements. Please stay calm." The passengers obeyed, though their eyes were wide with curiosity. Some clutched their phones tighter, still recording. Others leaned into the aisle, eager not to miss a moment. The cabin, once filled with whispers of confusion, now throbbed with anticipation. The flight attendant, the same woman who had humiliated Maya, earlier stood frozen near the front. Her posture was stiff, her jaw clenched, but her eyes betrayed her fear. She tried to speak to the officers first, her voice low, urgent, but one of them raised a hand. "Ma'am, we'll ask the questions. Please step aside." Gasps spread through the cabin. A few passengers nodded silently, their expressions almost satisfied. Justice, it seemed, had arrived at 30,000 feet well. Almost. Maya's heart pounded in her chest. She kept her eyes low, staring at her trembling hands folded on her lap. She didn't want attention, didn't want to be called out. But she also knew this was happening because of her call. Her aunt's promise had been real. "I'll handle it." The officers began speaking with the captain and the other flight attendants. Their voices were quiet, professional, but everyone could sense the tension. The crew who hadn't been involved in the shouting looked uneasy, shifting in place. Glancing nervously at the passengers who were still recording, and then the inevitable question came. One officer raised his voice just enough for the nearest rows to hear. "We've received reports of a confrontation involving a minor passenger. Where is she seated?" Every head turned at once. Dozens of eyes landed on Maya in her window seat. She felt the weight of their stares pressing down like a storm. Her throat tightened, her palms sweated. She wished the seat could swallow her whole. The officer's gaze softened when it met hers. He walked slowly down the aisle, crouching slightly so his eyes met hers at eye level. "Miss," he said gently, "are you all right?" Maya nodded quickly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Yes." The officer tilted his head, studying her trembling hands. "Would you be comfortable telling us what happened?" The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath. Maya's lips parted, but no words came. Her chest felt tight, her mind racing with the memory of the attendants shouting, the humiliation. The way her heart had nearly broken under the weight of it. Before she could speak, the man across the aisle leaned forward, his phone still in hand. "I recorded it," he said firmly. "Everyone here saw it. She didn't do a thing wrong." Voices rose in agreement. "That's right. She was just sitting there." The attendant was out of line. The officers glanced at each other, their expressions turning grim. One of them straightened and turned toward the flight attendant at the front. "Ma'am, please come with us." The woman's face flushed crimson. "This is ridiculous," she snapped. She was breaking the rules. She was being disrespectful. But the cabin erupted with voices of protest. No, she wasn't. That's a lie. We all saw what happened. The authority in numbers was undeniable. The passengers weren't just witnesses. They were her shield. The officer raised a hand, silencing the growing noise. His tone was steady, unshaken. "Ma'am, you'll have a chance to explain. For now, you are required to step off the aircraft with us." The flight attendant's face twisted in anger, but her hands trembled as she gathered her things. Her heels clicked sharply against the floor as she marched down the aisle. Her chin raised, but her pride clearly shattered. As she passed Maya's row, her eyes flicked down for only a second. Anger, humiliation, and disbelief all tangled in that glance. Maya held her breath, refusing to meet the woman's stare. She simply pressed her hand against her notebook inside her bag. The very object that had sparked it all, and kept her eyes forward. The door hissed open again, and the flight attendant stepped out, flanked by two officers. The heavy thud of the door closing behind them echoed like final judgment. The cabin erupted in murmurs once more. Some passengers shook their heads, muttering about justice. Others leaned across aisles, sharing the story in hushed tones as if they already knew this moment would go viral. Phones buzzed as people sent texts and uploaded videos. Maya exhaled shakily, her shoulders lowering for the first time since the confrontation began. The storm had passed, but its aftermath still lingered in the air. The officer crouched by her seat again. His voice was softer this time. "You did the right thing. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. Tears welled in her eyes, but they weren't from shame anymore. They were from relief. Passengers nearby gave her small nods, kind smiles. A woman reached across the aisle and whispered, "You were brave, sweetheart." The man with the phone added, "Good for you. Don't ever let anyone silence you." For the first time, Maya allowed herself a small, shaky smile. The captain's voice returned once more, calm and composed. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We will be resuming preparations for departure shortly. Please remain seated." The plane hadn't taken off yet, but for Maya, the journey had already changed everything. She had been humiliated, yes, but she had also found her strength. And now, the entire cabin had seen the truth. One girl, with one voice, had held someone accountable. And though the engines would roar again soon, carrying them into the sky, the lesson from this night would stay grounded in the minds of every witness forever. Asterisk, the plane eventually took off, hours later than planned. By then, the air inside the cabin felt lighter, though the tension still lingered like smoke after a fire. Passengers shifted in their seats, whispering to each other about what had just unfolded, replaying the moment over and over in disbelief. The roar of the engines filled the silence. But no one could forget the sound of the shouting, the sudden stop, or the sight of security escorting the flight attendant away. Maya sat quietly by the window, her head leaning against the cool glass. Outside, the city lights shimmered below like fallen stars, but her thoughts were far above them. She clutched her notebook against her chest, the very thing that had sparked it all, and tried to steady her racing heart. She was only 16. Yet she had just lived through something that would stay with her forever. The man across the aisle, the one who had recorded everything, leaned over slightly. His voice was gentle this time. "You did the right thing, kid. Don't ever forget that." Maya gave him a small nod, though her throat was too tight to speak. She wasn't used to people seeing her, not like this, not as the center of attention, not as the spark that had grounded an entire plane. But deep down, a part of her felt stronger than it ever had before. Hours later, when the plane landed and the passengers filed out, the story was already spreading. Videos had been uploaded, shared, commented on. Headlines would appear within hours. Teen girls call ground's entire plane after confrontation with flight attendant. Some would read it in shock, others in admiration, and many would see in it a lesson about respect and accountability. But for Maya, it wasn't about headlines or attention. It was about something deeper. At the arrivals hall, her aunt was waiting. The moment Maya stepped out, her aunt wrapped her in a fierce embrace, whispering into her ear, "I'm proud of you. You were brave." Maya's eyes welled with tears, but this time they weren't from fear or humiliation. They were from relief, from love, from the knowledge that she had done something that mattered. She had refused to stay silent, and in doing so, she had reminded everyone on that plane and soon everyone beyond it that no voice is too small when it speaks the truth. In the weeks that followed, the story traveled far. Passengers gave interviews, sharing what they had seen. A young girl unfairly shouted at, her dignity stripped away, but her courage unbroken. They described how the entire plane had been grounded because one teenager had chosen to make a single phone call. Some people online debated it. Some criticized, but most admired the lesson it carried. Teachers shared it with students. Parents shared it with children. And for Maya, it became a turning point in how she saw herself. She wasn't just the quiet girl with a notebook anymore. She was the girl who had stood up, who had refused to let injustice pass by, who had reminded everyone that respect was not optional. The passengers who had been there that night would never forget it either. They would tell the story for years to come at dinner tables, in classrooms, in quiet conversations with friends. They would say, "I was on that flight. I saw it with my own eyes." A young girl was shouted at, and instead of shrinking, she stood tall. She made a call, and everything changed. And as for the flight attendant, her story became a cautionary tale. Authority is not power when it is misused. Respect once broken cannot be restored by shouting. Maya often thought back to that night. Sometimes it came back in flashes, the sting of humiliation, the burning in her cheeks, the heavy silence after the yelling. But more often, she remembered the moment the plane turned back, the shift in the passengers' eyes, the quiet support that had surrounded her. She carried that strength with her into the future. Whenever she doubted herself, whenever she felt small, she remembered the night she made a call and the world listened, And the lesson lingered in the hearts of everyone who had been on that flight, that justice doesn't always roar in thunderous voices. Sometimes it begins in a whisper, in the trembling voice of a teenager refusing to be silenced. Sometimes it takes only one act of courage to remind the world that dignity and respect belong to everyone. The engines may have carried the plane into the sky that night, but the memory stayed grounded forever. A reminder, a warning, a lesson, and in the quiet corners of her life. Whenever Maya opened her notebook to write, she would smile faintly, knowing that her words, her voice mattered more than she had ever believed.